morning and welcome to the DEFCON Warning System Digest. I am Thomas Lonelywolf, the director of the DEFCON Warning System. Joining me today is Eric Wasson, the deputy director. He's the guy with the keys when I'm not there, so I'll light all candles to him. And also DEFCON staff member Billy Auger. I hope I got that name pronounced right. His will not be the only name I am mangling today. So before we begin, what we want to do is we want to see how these DEFCON digests are working for you guys who are looking at this. We want to know, do you find these informative? Are they useful to you? Do you go to our website and look over our articles? Do you go to our community forum, or do you only get your information from these YouTube videos, these digests, and these other these announcements that we post on YouTube? So we're kind of looking to see who visiting us on YouTube only gets information from us on YouTube, and that will kind of tell us, do we need to focus more on YouTube, or is this just supplemental to what we're doing on the website and things like that. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go a little more in depth into an article we wrote on August 3rd that was called Unpacking Medvedev's Nuclear Threats. And that's the name I just can't seem to get my tongue rolled over very easily. My wife's got it down pat, but not me. So with right now what's been going on is that, we're 500 and some odd days into Vladimir Putin's 3-day war against Ukraine. And when the war first broke out, there was understandably a lot of concern. Was NATO going to get involved? What was going to happen out there? Was it going to escalate? Was it going to go nuclear? And since this has been going on for so long, people have kind of gotten used to it. It's dropped out of the news. You still see it, we still see some reports, especially when the United States promises another aid package to Ukraine. But mostly, it's dropped out of the news cycle. People aren't interested in anymore. It's just not the exciting flavor of the day anymore. So we look at our stats on our website, and we can tell who's interested in certain threats and things like that. And the threat for Ukraine has really dropped off. But that's just the Western look on the war. How it's looking at how the United States public is interested in the war. How England is looking at the war. Billy, you can tell us a bit more about that. How is the United Kingdom as focused on the Ukraine war as it used to be at the beginning?
The main news company in the UK, the BBC, they still got a topic, especially at the top of the page, dedicated to the war in Ukraine. In conversations with people, the only time it comes up is, they say, "Oh, those poor Ukrainians," and I agree with them. But I think people keeping up to date with what's happening in Ukraine, it's just not happening as much as it was.
Yeah, it's pretty dropped out. Eric, what do you think? You follow all this stuff pretty well too, So have you? Is this something that seems to have dropped out of the American news cycle or the Western news cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been going on for over a year. None of the threats that were made or our initial concerns when the invasion first occurred have materialized, and we have basically settled into this may be a poor analogy, but it's the one that comes to mind. We've kind of settled into a Korean style deadlock where we have a well-established front line for the ground forces, and Ukraine and Russia keep lobbing drones and missiles at each other, and that's it. So nothing's really changing on a day-to-day basis. Ukraine makes some progress here, Russia makes some progress there. So yeah, the news cycle, the news media companies aren't interested in it anymore.
Yeah,
I'm afraid I'll have to disagree with you there, Eric. I don't think we're in a Korean-style situation. I don't think we're in a Korean-style situation at the moment. Simply the fact that honestly, I don't think we've seen Ukraine's full potential yet. Granted, when they get F-16s, because that will happen eventually. When they get F-16s, it won't make a huge bit of difference. But when they get all their armored divisions ready and raring to go, and they do an offensive, they could potentially make a breakthrough. I wouldn't rule that out. So I don't think we're yet in a Korean style situation.
I wasn't really comparing the Ukraine war to the Korean war per se. It's just that once the initial Korean war broke out, the front line kind of stabilized, and it moved back and it moved forward and it moved back and it moved forward. And that's the comparison I was making, is we kind of have the same situation in Ukraine. Is the front lines have been established, conflict to conflict, per se.
Well, the thing is, the war is just not interesting anymore until something major happens, like, Russia just steamrolls over the Ukraine lines and starts taking over a bunch of cities again, making a beeline for Kiev, or a city just disappears in a radioactive cloud. It's just not interesting anymore, especially because there's no threat of the United States or NATO getting involved. So, how does it's the how does this affect me syndrome, and that's what happened with the Korean War as well. It just didn't affect the home front, therefore it just wasn't interesting anymore.
I agree.
Yeah, you're right there, unfortunately.
The Vietnam War ran for how many years, and it didn't get interesting on the home front until they started having protests about it. And you had, I was too young at that time to know what was going on, so I really don't know. I don't think I think all of us here were kind of either not born, Billy, or were too young at that time to know what was going on. So I really couldn't comment on what it was like for the protests or anything like that.
There is one huge difference between the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and why the Vietnam War did impact the home front a little bit more. We had the technology then that embedded news reporters fighting with American troops could have that film back to the United States in time for the evening news. So, as the technology increases, and now from Ukraine, we see, live Twitter feeds. Anytime there's a missile attack or something like that. So, the technology for us keeping an eye on what's going on the front lines is amazing, but the media doesn't use any of that. They just, like you said, there's nothing interesting about what's going on.
Yeah, it's just not going to get the ratings. And I'm not trying to make the media out to be a bad guy. They report on what's going on, but they also are subject to, they need an audience. That's just the reality. That's just the reality of things. They're not government backed, so therefore they need to make money, and so they're going to focus on a story that makes them money. So the reason that we got into, why is the Ukraine war not sexy anymore, is because that's just the Western look on it. If you were to look at Russia or Ukraine, well, the Ukraine war is more at the forefront because they're the ones that are actively involved, and Russia continues to make threats about Ukraine, and Ukraine continues to make the publicity rounds in order to get more help for their war. And what we're focusing on here in this digest is, how much of a threat is the Ukraine war? Just because it's gone out of the news media cycle doesn't mean that it's not there anymore. And so these threats that are made by Russia, how real are they? And so that's why we wrote this article, Unpacking Medvedev's Nuclear Threats.
Вас правда волнует климат до такой степени? Так вот, на мой взгляд, это ничто в сравнении с перспективой оказаться в эпицентре взрыва с температурой в 5000 кельвинов, ударной волной в 350 метров в секунду и давлением в 3000 килограмм на метр квадратный, с проникающей радиацией, то есть ионизирующим излучением, и электромагнитным импульсом. Такая перспектива есть сегодня? Увы, да. И она растет с каждым днем по известным причинам.
Well, this guy Medvedev, he currently holds the deputy chairman title of the Security Council of Russia. and been making he's kind of the point guy when it comes to making these nuclear threats. There are a lot of nuclear threats going around. Belarus is making them and things like that. But Medvedev is the guy who's kind of like the point person. He's the rabid dog of Russia. So he was once the president of the Russian Federation, who was largely seen as a puppet of Putin because Putin was termed out of office. And then Putin, when he was eligible for the presidency again, Medvedev stepped aside and let Putin take office again. When he was in office, he was considered a moderate, and even the Western news media paint him as a moderate. He wasn't as radical as Putin was, but it was during Medvedev's time that the Georgia War did start. When Putin became president again, Medvedev moved over to prime minister and is now as the head of the Security Council. So this guy has a lot of history with Putin. He's basically Putin's right hand guy. So I think that puts him in a spot of being able to know what Putin's thinking. He's not just some hired hand, some hired goon that Putin put in there and really has no connection to Vladimir Putin. I think these guys are friends. That
they go way back.
They go way back. I was bad. I didn't do as much research on Medvedev as I should have, so I couldn't tell you how far back they went. I know they went back pretty far, but were they school chums or something like that, or where did they meet or something like that?
I must say I disagree with you about their friendship. There was a lot of speculation about Medvedev's supposed resignation from the office of Prime Minister of Russia in 2020. I remember one source I've read actually claimed, it might have actually been Putin pushing him out of office instead of a voluntary resignation, perhaps concerned about he was accruing too much power and influence. I don't know. Putin's a paranoid man.
Well, he should be. But
lots of people are looking for his back to stab.
Yeah, but I think that when whatever his name is, when Dmitry Medvedev resigned, that was during when everybody was resigning in support of Vladimir Putin. So if I remember correctly, so I don't know if it was pushed out or because the office that Medvedev held really didn't have much power. It was that really truly is a puppet position to Putin's. So I don't really know if him resigning really had any that kind of impact, and if he was quietly gaining power, because if he was gaining power, Putin would have pushed him out completely. He wouldn't have given him the Security Council position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're probably right. Yeah.
Of course, how much power does Medvedev have now? And I'm just going to keep slaughtering that name. How much does he have now? I mean, he's a spokes guy, but what does he do in his position now?
I would probably liken him more to a chief of staff position here in the U.S. He's more of an advisor than he is somebody who actually calls the shots. Now, I think he's got Putin's ear. But as far as actual power, Putin does not hand out power willingly. So I'm going to say he's more in an advisor role. And like I said, it would be equivalent to somebody on the Joint Chief of Staff Joint Chiefs of Staff here in the United States. My opinion.
Honestly, I think he's one of the less powerful members of the council. I think there are many more powerful members on there. He's overshadowed by those other people. And when Russia did the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia changed there and then. The Russian political landscape was turned on its head, and politicians really they had two options if they want to stay where they were or move up the greasy pole, so to speak. They could either keep their heads down, try not to get on Putin's nerves, or they could do what Medvedev's been doing, which is making these hawkish-sounding statements to shore up his support back home. I think all these nuclear threats are more for the domestic Russian population than they actually are for the West. I'll be willing to argue that.
100% agree.
Yeah. It's just to shore up his power base and to give him a way forward and to stay in Putin's favor, to show that he's loyal and he supports the war.
Well, you made an interesting statement that the nuclear threats aren't for Russia so much as they are for the West. And I kind of agree with that. So let's look a little bit more into that. During the Ukraine war, Russian media and politicians, they've made a lot of statements about the war, mostly backing it, especially after the crackdown where they were kind of forced to back it. Otherwise, they'll be accused of treason. There are actual laws in Russia where you're not allowed to criticize the war or the military. Polls show that the public are in favor of it. Of course, criticizing, like I said, criticizing the war is illegal in Russia, so it's difficult to know whether the statements are what the person is actually feeling, or if they're actually required to say that. They're certainly not going to say on camera, I stand against the war, because they'll be getting a glass of tea, or they may slip out a window or something like that. Well, if you read some of the papers published, you'll see some advocate for the use of nuclear weapons to subdue the enemy, and discussion panels have joined in the call for war escalation, even against itself. There's some wonderful Twitter accounts for Western people to look at, and they'll take some of these Russian panels and they'll translate it into English, and they're kind of fascinating to watch. Some of them are pretty. They're just not hawkish about war. They're actually calling for nuclear strikes on the West, and you got to wonder if these guys are just hyping it up for the West. I don't know if those discussion panels are for the West, because they're broadcast mainly in Russia. So I'd say they're more for a Russian audience to continue drumming up the war, showing how the West is the enemy, and kind of taking the old North Korea tact of painting the West as an enemy who needs to just be put in their place and basically annihilated. They're basically trying to fan the flames of the Russian audience to support the war and support nuclear use if it ever comes to that. Whether that's actually working, polls seem to be showing the opposite. But those panels are pretty. Have you guys actually watched some of those panels? They're almost frightening to look at.
Yeah.
I've read some transcripts here and there. The thing of it is, Russia is selling this war to the Russian people by claiming Ukraine is a threat and NATO is a threat. And by threatening the use of nuclear weapons, they are kind of subliminally stating how big a threat they really think this is. Hey, NATO is such a big threat, we may have to resort to our nukes. This is for the Russian. This is for the Russian people. They've been making nuclear threats since day one of the war, and none of them have materialized. Now, based on what we do, though, we can't just stop paying attention to the threats. We have to look at each individual threat, analyze why it's being made, analyze its, how honest are they being about this threat. So we can't, excuse me, in our position, we can't ignore these threats. But I think the Western media it's the boy who cried wolf, so they're not paying attention to it anymore.
I think I agree with you. We do analyze these threats individually. And in Medvedev's case, I think it's almost, I wouldn't say solely, but mostly just to shore up his own political position. I really wouldn't, roll around in bed at night, losing sleep over it. It's not great to see, but, it's not the end of the world.
Well, there's the other thing where there is a huge difference between, and I'm going to switch to the United States as an example here in a second. There's a huge difference between the President of the United States making a threat of using our nuclear weapons and a senator making a threat of using our nuclear weapons. And so by Medvedev issuing these threats, Putin is one step removed from him. He's removed from the threats. So if the threats never materialize, if the nukes never get used, he's got, well, that was just Medvedev being overcautious or paranoid or whatever. But then if he does resort to nukes, he can go, well, we warned you. So that's kind of how I see it. There's a split, a buffer there for Putin for these threats being made.
I would say to a lesser extent, yes, but we've seen Putin making his nuclear threats before. Putin isn't a stranger from making nuclear threats.
I agree.
Yeah. So I think if I don't, he might be doing that, but I just don't think it's a very likely possibility.
Well, here's some quotes from Medvedev so far. Every time I pronounce his name, I look at his spelling, make sure I'm getting it right. Medvedev. Here are some of the things that he said. He said, just imagine if the offensive in tandem with NATO succeeded and ended up with part of our land being taken away. And he's talking about eastern Ukraine and especially Crimea. Mm-hmm. Then we would have to use nuclear weapons by virtue of the stipulations of the Russian presidential decree. Another quote, there simply wouldn't be any other solution. Our enemies should pray to our fighters that they do not allow the world to go up in nuclear flames. And that was a fairly recent quote. One thing that politicians of all stripes do not like to admit, such an apocalypse is not only possible, but also quite probable. A defeat of a nuclear power in a conventional war may trigger a nuclear war. And lastly, he said, imagine if the offensive, which is backed by NATO, was a success, and Russia believes this. But Russia believes this is a war with NATO. So anybody who's listening to this or watching this doesn't think that NATO isn't involved. It doesn't matter whether NATO is involved or not. It really doesn't. Russia thinks it is. Backed by NATO was a success, and they tore off a part of our land, again, talking about eastern Ukraine or especially Crimea, then we would be forced to use a nuclear weapon according to the rules of a decree from the president of Russia. These are all statements by Medvedev. And the question is, are these predictions or warnings? And another question that we have to ask ourselves is, if this guy is just throwing out threats just to be, the rattlesnake or the rabid dog, when do these empty threats become real threats? When to use the boy who cried wolf example, when did the wolf actually come? When is the boy actually telling the truth? How do we know which threat is the real threat?
Well, we've been talking about this since the invasion, and pretty much all of the DEFCON staff are in agreement that Crimea is absolutely a nuclear trigger, because that is the only warm water port they have. If Russia thinks they're going to lose Crimea, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, all the DEFCON staff are in agreement that Russia will resort to nuclear weapons to protect that port. Now, as far as southeast Ukraine, for the Donbass region, Luhansk region, that area, that's kind of up in the air. Russia looks at that as their land now, but would they really? There's nothing there of really strategic importance. So would they really use nukes to defend non-strategic land? That's kind of up in the air. But I think Crimea absolutely is a valid nuclear trigger.
Yeah, I'm afraid I agree with you there.
So you walk right into this quote by Sir Winston Churchill in a radio broadcast in October of 1939. He once said about Russia, he said, I cannot forecast to you the actions of Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, but perhaps there is a key, and that key is a Russian national Russian national interest. So when we look at Ukraine, what is a Russian national interest? Now, if Ukraine were to just blow through Russian forces and decide, hey, we're going to start, we're going to take a little bit of Russia because as a penalty for invading us, then there's a Russian national interest. But what in Ukraine is a Russian national interest? Crimea, that warm water port. Now, someone pointed out that they have another warm water port, but that's just because the weather's been getting warmer. The Crimea port is warm water all year long, all the time, throughout history. And so that is a Russia. They leased the warm water port from Crimea when Ukraine was an ally. It's only when Ukraine started walking away from Russia, when there was that I don't want to call it a coup, but when there was that change in presidency to a more Western-friendly president,
right,
that Russia started looking at Crimea and thinking, we're going to lose this warm water port, and that's when that's when they invaded. So it's all about that warm water port. That is their national interest.
Absolutely.
Honestly, I think there's another national interest here.
Oh, hit me. Go for it.
If the Russian military is on the verge of complete collapse, if their conventional forces were to, let's say, be days away from a collapse, I think then a nuclear use could be a possibility.
Maybe.
Are you suggesting that if the Russian forces in eastern Ukraine were on the verge of defeat, Russia would use nuclear weapons to defend their position in eastern Ukraine, sans Crimea?
I think if the conventional forces were doing so appallingly bad, where their collapse is imminent, they're about to completely lose all cohesion, I think the thought would certainly enter Putin's mind at least. I can't tell you what Putin's going to do. I'm not a mind reader. I'm not Mystic Madge, but if I was him, it would certainly enter my mind.
Yeah, if that happens in southeastern Ukraine, in Donetsk, Luhansk, Mariupol, those areas, I don't know that I agree with you. But if the forces collapse in Crimea, then, and especially if Ukraine starts to take advantage of that and move into Crimea, absolutely 100%.
Oh yeah, I agree with you there. Yeah.
Southeast Ukraine, I don't know. I can't call that one. But I do agree with the director. If Ukraine at any point crosses the border and by border I mean the pre-existing border to the war, crosses the border into Russia, that's going to be a bad move. That's a bad strategic decision on their part.
Well, we've always seen one raid from a group that that aren't affiliated with the Ukrainian state move in more of a raid style thing. But I think I agree. If it was a proper invasion, with actual Ukrainian forces moving in to take territory, I agree with you that probably would result in nuclear weapons use.
Well, fortunately, I can't see Ukraine invading Russia.
No,
neither can
I. We're just tossing out ridiculous notions now.
Well, no, and absolutely, and even if that were to occur to Zelensky, the West would never let him do it.
Yeah,
they would immediately halt all shipments of weapons to Ukraine at that point.
Yeah.
If Zelensky, so yeah, I agree.
Well, no, Poland would probably still keep doing it, and a few other.
We were talking about what would be some of the triggers, and that is a trigger, but it's not a likely one.
Yeah,
I don't think that's going to happen.
I'm not sure.
But it's still worth discussing.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that Russia would use nuclear weapons to defend their captures in eastern Ukraine. I agree with you, Billy, that certainly Putin could think about it. Just because it would be a massive loss of face if they were to lose what they've taken in this recent war. But would he cross the line to go nuclear? I don't think so. I could be wrong. Certainly, if that happens, we'll definitely be looking at statements made by Russia in regards to nuclear use. We'd certainly be watching very closely what their military does. But I'm not seeing it as much as I would. I'm not seeing that happen as much as I would if it was Crimea. Crimea, I can absolutely see it happening. Eastern Ukraine, not. You'd have to prove it to me for Eastern Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The one thing I will say is Russia does have their philosophy of escalate to de-escalate, and so it may be part of. They may come to the realization and say, hey, you know what? If we pop off a tactical nuke, that'll be our shock and awe campaign, and NATO and Ukraine will completely back down, and that's where it stops. And that's a huge gamble. That's a very, very risky thing to do. Yeah. But that is part of Russian military strategy: is escalate to de-escalate.
I think Putin would only go for that if he had absolutely no cards left, and he only had that Hail Mary left.
I agree. The southeastern Ukraine topic, that one's up in the air. That's not an instant. There's room for doubt in there.
It's more of a gray area.
Yeah, it's very gray. Whether he would do it or not, we could debate that. Yes, he would. No, he wouldn't. And we could support both arguments. That again, the only for sure 100% use of nuclear weapons by Russia that I foresee is loss of Crimea.
Yeah.
I'll go just a little bit different on that, and I think this is just me being pedantic. Is that I think the only absolutely 100% for sure use of nuclear weapons would be an invasion of Russia proper. Crimea is a 99.9% use of nuclear weapons.
That's fair enough. Russia does consider Crimea to be Russian territory at this point.
Yeah.
So, all right, I'll give you that 0.1%. Yeah.
Because their conventional forces could still pull it out of the hat. Who knows? Yeah. There could be a Steiner's offensive waiting in the wings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think... Go ahead.
I'll give you the 0.1 and agree it's 100% if Ukraine was to invade the Russian motherland. 99.9 on Crimea. I'm fine with that.
I think that whole escalate to de-escalate, we could talk about that if Russian forces were just overrun. They're just beaten back miles and miles per day. If it's incremental, then maybe there's always that. I'm not so sure that Russia would resort to escalate to de-escalate. But if they're shocked by just a rout and they're driven back, tens of miles, a day, then maybe they might be scared enough that Ukraine would actually cross the border into Russia, and that might trigger an escalate to de-escalate. Of course, they just may escalate, de-escalate just if the war drags out and Ukraine starts making these incremental advances as well, and Russia just starts running out of people to throw at the front line. But we were talking about this before we started recording today, that we're in August now and winter is coming up, and the Ukraine front is kind of bogged down. They're still making progress, but it's not as much as they wanted. The F-16s aren't going to be there for a few months, and so we may look at a stalemate for the winter, and just wait until next spring to see what happens.
Yeah,
but who knows? Maybe the Ukrainian High Commander got something planned. I don't know.
I have no idea. But with regard to the nuclear threats, U.S. President Joe Biden has warned that the nuclear threats are real. So the United States is definitely taking them seriously. At least when they're looking at. I don't know when they say that they're real. I don't know what they mean by that, because there's a lot of political speak in that. They may be looking at the same way that we look at it. That they're just kind of empty threats now, but we're going to look at each individual one, see what's going on, analyze it, and then say this may have some meat behind it, or this is just another boy who cried wolf. Someone throwing a temper tantrum.
Yeah, that's what I think is going on. They recognize actually Russia has an advantage on use of nuclear weapons over Ukraine that NATO doesn't, and that Ukraine doesn't, and that's that Ukraine is not a NATO member, so the chances of a nuclear response to a nuclear weapon being used over Ukraine is actually pretty low, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Especially if it's just one. NATO's not going to respond nuclear with that.
The United States has already said that the options are open. They have already said that nuclear use by Russia in Ukraine will not result in an automatic nuclear response. So they've left it open for a nuclear response, but they've also left it open for a conventional response.
That's typical US strategy with their
it is, yeah. And
they always leave their options open.
In my opinion, there's no way NATO is going to risk a global confrontation over a single tactical nuke over a non-NATO country. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Now, is conventional use going to increase? Are arms shipments going to increase? Yeah. But it's. I think Russia could get away with it if they wanted to, and I think that's why the U.S. is taking it seriously.
Yeah.
A tactical use over a military target, or over a battalion of soldiers, or even in a demonstration in an unpopulated area. Yeah, I think the United States or the West would kind of be shocked, but I don't see them responding nuclear to that. If they were to vaporize Kiev, even then maybe not. But I would certainly start stocking my larder if that happened.
Absolutely. But we have no agreement with Ukraine.
Yeah.
Europe, Poland is extremely concerned about how this is playing out. Poland is not going to be in favor of a nuclear response because they're right there on the front lines. They're going to be the first ones hit. So there's going to be a schism within NATO probably about whether to respond with nukes or not.
Yeah, I just don't see nuclear use happening from NATO unless you had, people dying from fallout in, in Eastern Europe, NATO countries.
That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen.
No, it won't.
Nuclear. Yeah.
It won't unless you did it right on the border, which the Russians aren't stupid enough to do.
Right.
There's a great a video put out by the BBC, and it was called. I might get the name wrong, but it's called "In the Bunker" or something like that. In the War Room, or it was where.
Was that the new one or the Threads one?
No, the new one.
Oh, the new one, yeah.
Okay.
It was where a crisis was developing, and a bunch of advisors to the government gathered in a war room or something.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes, it's Cobra, isn't it?
Huh?
Yeah, Cobra Committee. Yeah,
it's the Cobra Committee in the UK. Yeah, that's what you're talking.
And in this scenario, and these were real people. These are people who held the job previously, and so we got to watch how they debated whether they should use nuclear weapons over a nuclear weapon used by Russia. And then I think the United States decided they were going to respond with a nuclear weapon, and Britain said we're not going to go along with it. So that's what brought it to mind when Billy said that, you know, NATO, there's going to be a fracture in NATO as to whether to respond to a nuclear weapon use by Russia. You know, NATO may not be united whether to respond nuclear wise. And son of a gun, if I could only just remember. I love that.
I've seen it.
We'll link it in the description. Don't you guys worry.
Yeah, oh, I hope so, because I'll forget. So you're gonna have to remind me to do that.
Yeah. No, I've seen that.
And I have a copy of it. I have a copy of it.
Yeah,
it's in my thing, and I just can't remember the name of it. But it's
yeah,
really fascinating.
They arrived
to
at the conclusion that we're not going to use nukes, and I was actually kind of surprised that's how it ended. But you know, Europe has already been through 2 world wars. That the United States was pretty much untouched. Europeans are going to be really, really hesitant to get involved in a third one.
Yeah, Europeans have always been kind of passive. Even that's kind of their nature. Even before World War II, they kind of did everything they could to try and avoid it, which just kind of, you know, gave Hitler, you know, the impetus to just keep going, because he didn't think anyone was going to stop him. So that's how he got World War II, by just, you know, not being willing to do what was necessary to stop him when there was still a chance. That's why we have North Korea as it is now. Nobody's willing to stop it until now it's too late. That's why China is expanding into the South China Sea, because no one's willing to stop them until it's going to be too late. Now we have Iran working on a nuclear weapon. And I know a lot of people say that's not what's happening. That's just propaganda. That's just Iran is working on a nuclear weapon. If you don't want to believe it, don't believe it. They're going to have one. So because no one's willing to stop them while they can stop them. And then when it's too late, what are you going to do now? Now we have the problem with North Korea. It's too late to stop them, because now if you nuke them or go into them, they're going to use nukes, and there goes Seoul, and there goes, you know, a couple other places.
Tokyo.
Tokyo. So what's going to happen now? So this also comes back to the debate of what to do about Ukraine. You know, Ukraine is not the United States, so therefore there's a faction in the United States is saying, why are we over there? Why are we spending so much money? Why are we getting involved in a war that can involve ourselves? But the other side of the coin is, okay, if you don't stop Russia now, what's going to happen when they learn that they can chop off parts of countries and nothing's going to happen? This is how the old Soviet Warsaw
salami
Pact grew.
tactics.
Because
I would like to
them.
throw in, we do. And I keep bringing this up to people because a lot of people seem to have forgotten about this. Back in '93, we had the Budapest Memorandum, and the U.S. and Russia and France and a couple others that slip my mind at the moment, they all agreed to guarantee Ukraine's borders as they existed in 1993 if they handed over their nuclear weapons to Russia, which they did. And in 2014, Russia goes into Crimea. We did not honor that Budapest Memorandum. That was our time to stop Russia, and then this invasion would not be taking place.
Yeah. I guarantee you, if NATO forces went into Crimea, the Russians would have turned their tail and went straight back to Russia.
Yeah, we had our chance. We had our chance in 2014. We didn't do it. We were obligated to do it under the terms of the Budapest Memorandum, and so that's why we're in this mess now.
Yeah. So this digest has gone on. We're talking about only having it 12 minutes long, because we know people don't like long digests. But we just go off on these tangents and things like that. And we get down into the nitty gritty, and it just goes longer than we meant. But the bottom line is, you know, we know that, you know, while Russia may be looking to revive old Soviet days and is now expanding empire, it may believe in historical territory, protecting its citizens, and whatever else it claims. But the warm water port in Crimea is what it needs, and Russia will protect it by whatever means necessary. And we don't want you to doubt that. So, you know, when Medvedev is giving these nuclear threats, he's giving the world a warning. Russia's red lines have been very flexible, but it stops at that port. They are going to defend that port. If you see Ukraine troops moving into Crimea, our conclusion is to start to get worried about that. It's Crimea. So you know, the nuclear threats made by Russia, yes, they are kind of bluffing. Yes, they are kind of telling NATO to stay out of it, which NATO is kind of ignoring. But when it comes to that warm water port, they mean every word they say. They are going to defend that. So last words from everybody. Eric, what do you want to say?
Just on a general scale, and I say this repeatedly in various places, as long as nuclear weapons exist, on a long enough timeline, their use is guaranteed 100%. Now, that may be in our lifetimes, it may not, but as long as we have nuclear weapons in play, I guarantee you they will get used again. So this may be it. It's been over 70 years since the last time, but who knows? So that's kind of my play on it, and we do have to take Russia seriously on their nuclear threats. They have the capability to follow through on them very easily.
Billy, up to you.
Well, I just think it's important to say, there's an awful lot of noise going on out there, and we'd like to help you cut through that noise. So please do keep following us, because we will alert you if there's something you desperately need to know. So please do stay up to date, stay tuned with us, because we will tell you what's going on.
Yep.
Yeah, it's the one thing we don't do that a lot of these other accounts do. What they do is they tweet out every little detail for clicks. They want people to look at them. They get ad revenue from that. They get revenue from Twitter and stuff like that, or X, or whatever he wants to call it now. But what we do is we're kind of conservative about how we tweet out or what we tweet out, because we want to give you information that you need to know, and not little trivia bits of information in order to get you to click on our thing. So that's why our Twitter account is a little on the quiet side, but we found that people like it that way. Nobody wants an active DEFCON Twitter feed, because that means something is going terribly wrong. So it's good that we're quiet, but we do tweet out an article a day or something like that, just to give you something to look at, food for thought and things like that. But do come over to our community forum. That's where you can interact with the DEFCON staff. You can get more in-depth stuff, and that's where a lot of stuff is analyzed not only by us, but by people who are interested in these things, and we take rumor that's coming through, and we pick it apart, analyze it, and find out, is this true? Is this fact? Or is this just somebody exaggerating? Or is this information that just cannot be confirmed? Or even is this, is this a photo from something that came 20 years ago that someone's trying to claim is true today? So we're really good at doing stuff like that. So joining us on the community forum, you don't have to make an account in order to read it, but you do have to make an account in order to comment on it, because we want to make sure that you're committed to, what you're saying, and not just some fly-by-night who just wants to throw some stupid thing out there and then just run away. So, stand behind what you say.
Absolutely. Thank you for tuning in. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. We'll see you for our next DEFCON Warning System Digest.